The 390 BCE sack of Rome by the Gauls under Brennus sits in that uncomfortable space between trauma and myth. And that's exactly why it mattered so much to Roman identity. Militarily, it was a disaster. A migrating Gallic force defeated the Roman army at the River Allia and marched almost unopposed into Rome, burning much of the city and forcing the survivors to barricade themselves on the Capitoline Hill. The episode exposed how fragile early Rome still was, poorly coordinated, militarily inexperienced, and far from the inevitable power it would later claim to be. But psychologically, the sack mattered far more than the physical damage. For centuries afterward, Rome remembered this moment as the humiliation, the proof that the city could fall, that its gods could be ignored, and that its walls were not destiny. Even when later historians exaggerated details or reshaped the narrative, the fear remained real. The phrase "vi victis," woe to the conquered, attributed to Brennus, became less a historical quote than a moral warning. What's striking is how Rome responded. The sack did not break the city, it hardened it. In its aftermath, Rome rebuilt its defenses, reformed its army, and adopted a far more aggressive stance toward its neighbors. Memory of vulnerability turned into policy. Expansion, domination, and preemptive violence were no longer optional. They were survival strategies. In that sense, 390 BCE wasn't just a catastrophe, it was a turning point. Rome learned that power had to be permanent, walls had to be stronger than memory, and fear had to be exported before it could return. The empire that would later claim to bring order to the world was, in part, born from the ashes of a city that once burned and never forgot it. By the early 4th century BCE, Rome believed it had survived its most dangerous years. The monarchy was long gone. The republic, though young and imperfect, had endured internal conflict, social tension, and near-constant war. Rome had fought its neighbors, the Latins, the Sabines, the Etruscans, not once but repeatedly. Each conflict reinforced the same quiet assumption. The city might struggle, it might bleed, but it would endure. This confidence did not come from arrogance alone. Rome had earned it. Its armies were disciplined by Italian standards. Its political system, though unstable, produced leaders accustomed to crisis. Its citizens were shaped by scarcity, not excess. Rome was not rich, but it was resilient. Yet this confidence concealed a dangerous illusion. Rome's wars until this point had all taken place within a familiar world. Its enemies shared similar weapons, similar tactics, and most importantly, similar assumptions about war itself. Battles followed rituals. Negotiations followed customs. Even betrayal followed understood rules. Rome knew how to interpret these signals. It knew how to respond. What Rome did not understand was the possibility of an enemy who did not share those assumptions at all. To the Romans of this period, the world was divided not by geography but by familiarity. Italy was knowable. Beyond it lay uncertainty. The northern regions, in particular, existed more as rumor than reality, lands of forests, migrations, and peoples who did not build cities the way Romans did. These were not enemies Rome had planned to face. And planning mattered. The Roman military system of the early Republic was not yet the flexible, adaptive machine it would later become. It relied heavily on citizen levies, seasonal campaigning, and commanders whose authority depended as much on politics as on skill. Rome could mobilize quickly against known rivals, but it struggled to react to threats that did not announce themselves in familiar ways. Internally, too, Rome remained fragile. The conflict of the orders still shaped political life. Patricians and plebeians contested access to power, land, and legal protection. Though compromises had been reached, trust was incomplete. Unity existed more in rhetoric than in reality. In moments of pressure, Rome's cohesion could fracture. This matters because Rome's later mythology often presents the Republic as already destined for greatness, as though strength naturally preceded empire. But in truth, early Republican Rome lived with constant uncertainty. Its institutions were untested. Its authority over its territory was uneven. Its dominance was asserted, not guaranteed. And yet, despite all this, Rome felt secure. The city's recent history encouraged that feeling. Rome had recovered from defeats before. It had absorbed losses, regrouped, and returned stronger. Each survival reinforced a belief that danger was temporary and that Rome itself was permanent. That belief extended to the city's physical space. Rome's early defenses were modest. Walls existed, but they were incomplete and inconsistent. The city relied less on stone than on confidence. Confidence that no enemy would reach its gates without warning. Confidence that Rome would always have time to respond. This assumption proved fatal. What Rome did not yet grasp was that danger does not always arrive slowly. Sometimes it moves faster than institutions can adapt. Sometimes it does not ask permission, declare intent, or follow precedent. To the north, forces were already in motion. Entire peoples were migrating, driven by pressures Rome neither understood nor controlled. These movements were not campaigns in the Roman sense. They were not wars with clear objectives or treaties. They were waves, shaped by hunger, opportunity, and momentum. Rome had no framework for this kind of threat. When the Gauls first appeared in Roman awareness, they were not immediately recognized as an existential danger. They were categorized as just another foreign group, unfamiliar, perhaps aggressive, but ultimately manageable. Rome's past experience suggested that force, negotiation, or delay would resolve the situation. This misreading would have consequences. More importantly, Rome misunderstood itself. The Republic believed that survival was proof of invulnerability, that endurance in past crises guaranteed endurance in future ones. But history does not work that way. Resilience without adaptation becomes rigidity. Confidence without preparation becomes blindness. In hindsight, Rome before the sack appears like a structure whose foundations were strong, but whose walls were unfinished. It could endure pressure from within its expectations, but not from outside them. This is what makes the sack of 390 BCE so significant, not because Rome fell for the first time, but because it fell without understanding why. The shock that was coming would not simply destroy buildings. It would dismantle assumptions about safety, about enemies, about destiny itself. Rome would survive the sack, yes, but it would never again trust survival alone as proof of strength. Before that lesson could be learned, Rome first had to be confronted with the unthinkable, the realization that the city was not yet ready for the world it was entering. Long before Rome understood that it was in danger, the forces that would threaten it were already moving. The Gauls did not appear suddenly at Rome's borders, nor did they march with a single plan or unified command. Their arrival in Italy was the result of slow pressure building far beyond the Roman horizon, pressures that unfolded over generations, not campaigns. To the Romans, this movement seemed abrupt and irrational. In reality, it was anything but. Northern Europe in the early 4th century BCE was a world shaped by motion. Communities expanded and contracted with climate, harvests, and opportunity. Land that once sustained a population could, over time, fail it. When that happened, migration was not a choice but a necessity. Entire groups moved not as armies but as societies, warriors, families, livestock, and memory traveling together. For Rome, this distinction mattered profoundly, though it would only realize it later. Roman warfare was structured around intent. Wars were declared, enemies were identified. Victory was pursued until submission or treaty. Migration, by contrast, followed no such logic. It did not seek Rome. Rome simply lay in its path. The Gauls were part of a broad Celtic cultural world stretching across much of Europe. They were not unified politically, nor did they share a single identity beyond language, custom, and material culture. Roman writers would later compress them into a single category: Galli, but this was a simplification born of fear and distance. What set the Gauls apart in Roman eyes was not merely their appearance or weapons, but their unpredictability. They fought differently. They moved differently. They did not establish cities in the Roman sense, nor did they anchor power to permanent urban centers. Their strength lay in mobility, cohesion within the warband, and an aggressive style of combat that emphasized shock and momentum. To Romans, this seemed chaotic. To the Gauls, it was practical. As pressure built in the north, groups crossed the mountains into the Italian peninsula. These crossings were not acts of invasion in the Roman sense, but transitions into lands perceived as fertile, wealthy, and lightly defended. Italy represented opportunity. The natural barrier that Romans assumed would protect them, the great northern mountain range, proved more permeable than imagined. Paths existed, knowledge traveled, and once one group crossed successfully, others followed. The Gauls who entered Italy encountered a landscape very different from their homelands. The Po Valley offered rich agricultural land and room to settle. Some groups remained there, integrating into the region. Others continued southward, drawn by stories of cities, wealth, and prestige. Rome, at this time, was not the ultimate prize. It was one city among many, important locally, but not yet dominant enough to command distant attention. This is a crucial point often missed in later retellings. The sack of Rome was not the culmination of a long-planned campaign. It was an encounter born of overlapping movements and misjudgments. Roman sources, written centuries later, struggled to explain this reality. Faced with an enemy that did not fit Roman categories, historians retroactively imposed motive. They described Gallic greed, aggression, or barbarism as if these qualities alone explained the events. But these explanations reveal more about Roman discomfort than Gallic intent. The truth is simpler and more unsettling. Rome was not targeted because it was Rome. It was encountered because it stood in the way. This misunderstanding would shape everything that followed. When Roman envoys and commanders first encountered the Gauls, they treated them as they would any other foreign power, assuming negotiations would follow familiar patterns, that intimidation would deter them, or that limited force would be sufficient. None of these assumptions held. The Gauls did not share Rome's diplomatic language. They did not recognize its authority, and they did not fear its reputation. This was not because they were reckless, but because Rome's reputation had not yet reached them in any meaningful way. From the Gallic perspective, Italy was not a political map of states and treaties. It was terrain. Rivers, plains, hills, and resources mattered more than borders. Resistance was evaluated not in terms of legitimacy, but in terms of strength. And here lay Rome's fatal vulnerability. Rome believed itself stronger than it was because it measured strength by victories within a familiar system. The Gauls measured strength by immediate outcomes, by whether an opponent could stop them now, not whether it might later claim revenge. As Gallic groups moved deeper into Italy, friction became inevitable. Towns were displaced. Fields were seized. Tensions escalated not because of ideological hostility, but because two incompatible ways of understanding power collided. Rome was not prepared for that collision. There was no grand strategy to stop the migration, no northern defensive doctrine, no intelligence network capable of tracking movements far beyond Italian territory. Rome's attention remained fixed on its traditional rivals, even as a fundamentally different challenge approached. This is the deeper tragedy of the moment. Rome did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it did not yet understand the scale of the world it was entering. The Republic still thought in local terms, while forces shaped by continental pressures were already reshaping the map. The Gauls carried no written manifestos, no declarations of war, no claims to destiny. They carried momentum, and momentum does not negotiate. By the time Rome fully realized that these movements posed an existential threat, the space for preparation had already vanished. The Gauls were no longer distant. They were already within the Italian world, already testing its limits. The sack of Rome would later be remembered as an isolated catastrophe, but in truth, it was the point at which two historical rhythms collided: Rome's slow institutional growth and Europe's faster currents of migration and displacement. Rome would survive that collision, but only by learning a lesson it had never needed before: that strength without awareness is vulnerability, and that the world beyond familiar borders can arrive without warning. When Rome finally entered direct contact with the Gauls, the encounter did not begin with violence. It began, as Rome expected most conflicts to begin, with diplomacy. This alone reveals how profoundly the Romans misunderstood the situation they were facing. To Roman political culture, diplomacy was not merely a tool, it was a framework for reality. War and peace existed on a spectrum governed by custom, precedent, and ritual. Envoys were sacred. Negotiations followed established patterns. Even enemies were expected to recognize certain boundaries, because those boundaries defined what it meant to participate in the civilized world. The Gauls did not share this framework. The first major point of contact occurred near the Etruscan city of Clusium, a settlement with which Rome had long-standing ties. When Gallic groups appeared in the region, tensions escalated quickly. Clusium, unaccustomed to such pressure and unable to repel it alone, appealed to Rome for assistance. From Rome's perspective, this was routine. A nearby ally requested intervention. Roman envoys would assess the situation, assert authority, and ideally restore balance without open war. The Republic still believed that its growing influence carried weight beyond its borders. It did not. Roman envoys were dispatched north. Their task, at least formally, was to negotiate, to persuade the Gauls to move on, to respect existing settlements, or to accept terms that preserved Roman interests. But even before the talks began, the process was compromised. Roman diplomacy was never neutral. Envoys were not detached observers. They were representatives of Roman power, accustomed to being obeyed. Their authority rested not on persuasion alone, but on the assumption that Rome's word mattered. To the Gauls, this assumption meant nothing. The discussions quickly revealed the gap between the two sides. Roman envoys spoke the language of borders, rights, and restraint. The Gauls spoke of land, need, and strength. Where Romans appealed to legitimacy, the Gauls evaluated opportunity. These were not two positions in conflict. They were two conversations happening at once. Then diplomacy collapsed entirely. According to Roman tradition, the envoys violated one of the very principles they claimed to uphold. During a skirmish outside Clusium, members of the Roman delegation allegedly took up arms against the Gauls. In doing so, they crossed a line that Roman law itself defined as inviolable. Envoys were not to fight. Whether this account is fully accurate matters less than what Romans believed about it later. In Roman memory, this moment became a symbol of moral failure, a reminder that Rome's own actions helped unleash the disaster that followed. From the Gallic perspective, however, the violation carried a different meaning. If Roman envoys fought, they were no longer sacred messengers. They were combatants, and combatants could be answered with force. When the Gauls demanded satisfaction, specifically, the punishment of the envoys, Rome refused. To comply would have meant acknowledging that Roman representatives were subject to foreign judgment. The Republic chose prestige over prudence. This decision proved catastrophic. By protecting its envoys, Rome believed it was defending its dignity. In reality, it was confirming the Gauls' assessment that Rome did not negotiate in good faith. The encounter hardened attitudes on both sides, turning a volatile situation into an irreversible one. What followed was not a formal declaration of war, but something far more dangerous: the collapse of restraint. The Gauls did not march on Rome because they sought conquest in the Roman sense. They marched because conflict had become personal. Honor, insult, and retaliation now mattered more than territory. In this context, Rome was no longer just a city, it was a symbol. This is where Roman sources begin to shift tone. Later historians frame the Gallic response as barbaric excess, an irrational escalation driven by rage. But beneath that framing lies a more uncomfortable truth: Rome had misjudged its leverage. The Republic assumed that its status would shield it from consequences. It assumed that even if mistakes were made, Rome could still control the outcome. These assumptions were rooted in a worldview where Rome was already central, already authoritative. In 390 BCE, it was neither. The failure at Clusium exposed the limits of Roman power in a way no battlefield defeat yet had. It showed that Rome could provoke forces it could not contain, that its diplomatic tools were effective only within a shared cultural system and meaningless outside it. Once that boundary was crossed, events accelerated beyond Rome's control. The Gauls did not wait for formalities. They did not send ultimatums. They began moving south with intent, following the most direct path toward the source of insult. Roman leaders, suddenly aware that negotiation had failed, scrambled to respond. But response requires time, and time was already gone. Rome's army had not been mobilized for this kind of threat. There had been no preparation, no reconnaissance, no strategic planning. The Republic had treated the Gallic presence as a local disturbance, not as an approaching catastrophe. Now, the reality could no longer be ignored. What began as a diplomatic exchange ended as a test of survival. The road to Rome was opening, not because the Gauls were unstoppable, but because Rome had helped remove the barriers that might have slowed them. This is the tragedy of the moment. Rome's greatest weapon, its confidence in its own systems, became its greatest weakness. The Republic acted as though the world operated by Roman rules, and when it did not, Rome found itself exposed. The encounter at Clusium did not cause the sack of Rome by itself, but it ensured that when violence came, it would come without restraint, without negotiation, and without delay. When the Roman army finally moved to confront the Gauls, it did so under the weight of assumptions that no longer matched reality. The engagement took place near the River Allia, a small tributary of the Tiber, not far from Rome itself. In Roman memory, the name Allia would become synonymous with disaster, a word that needed no explanation, only remembrance. What is striking is how close the battle occurred to the city. Rome did not meet the Gauls at a distant frontier. It did not buy time with layered defenses or forward positions. The confrontation happened almost at Rome's doorstep, a sign of how rapidly events had overtaken planning. The Roman army that assembled was not insignificant, but it was unprepared. This was still the early Republic, before the reforms that would later define Roman military power. The army consisted largely of citizen soldiers, men drawn from farming families, accustomed to seasonal warfare against familiar enemies. They had discipline, but little experience facing opponents who fought in radically different ways. Roman commanders expected a conventional engagement: two forces meeting, lines forming, pressure applied, victory decided by endurance and cohesion. The Gauls had no intention of obliging these expectations. Ancient sources describe the Gallic host as large, loud, and intimidating. Warriors advanced with long shields, heavy swords, and an emphasis on shock. Noise, speed, and psychological impact were not byproducts of their style, they were weapons. Rome had faced fierce enemies before, but it had rarely faced an enemy whose primary objective was to break morale as quickly as possible. The Roman deployment reflected uncertainty. Rather than forming a strong, compact center, the army stretched its line, attempting to avoid being outflanked. In doing so, it thinned its ranks, sacrificing stability for width. This decision would prove fatal. When the Gauls attacked, they did not press evenly along the line. They focused their force, driving hard against the weaker Roman flank. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. The Roman line did not bend, it fractured. Once a portion of the army broke, panic spread faster than command. Soldiers who had trained to hold formation now found themselves isolated, facing an enemy whose aggression allowed no pause. The battle dissolved into a rout. What followed was not a heroic last stand, but something far more dangerous: disintegration. Some Roman soldiers fled toward the Tiber, discarding weapons and armor in their haste. Many drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others scattered across the countryside, carrying news of defeat faster than any messenger. Crucially, there was no organized retreat to Rome. This detail matters. Roman defeats in later centuries often involved fallback positions, regrouping, and renewed resistance. At the Allia, there was none of that. The army ceased to exist as a coherent force in a single afternoon. For the Gauls, the victory was decisive. They had not merely defeated an enemy, they had removed the only obstacle between themselves and the city. For Rome, the consequences were immediate and existential. There was no second army waiting, no reserve force prepared to defend the city. The Republic had committed what it had, and what it had was gone. The psychological shock of the defeat cannot be overstated. Rome had lost battles before, but rarely so completely, and never so close to home. The illusion that distance and time would protect the city evaporated in an instant. Even worse, the Romans now faced a terrifying uncertainty. What would the victors do next? Roman warfare assumed that enemies sought advantage, territory, or leverage. Defeated cities were often spared total destruction if they submitted. Negotiation, ransom, or alliance remained possibilities. But the Gauls did not operate within that framework. After the rout, they did not pursue the fleeing soldiers aggressively. Instead, they advanced deliberately toward Rome itself. This behavior confused Roman observers then and historians later. Why pause after such a victory? Why not press the advantage? The answer lies in differing conceptions of victory. For the Gauls, the enemy army had been destroyed. The road lay open. There was no urgency to chase broken men. The true prize was ahead, undefended and vulnerable. Rome, meanwhile, was paralyzed. News of the defeat arrived before any organized force could return. Panic spread through the city as survivors recounted the scale of the disaster. Leaders realized that the city's defenses were inadequate and that there was no time to repair them. What had been unthinkable only days before was now unavoidable. Rome would have to decide what could be saved and what would be abandoned. The Battle of the Allia thus represents more than a military failure. It marks the moment when Rome's assumptions collapsed completely. The Republic had believed that wars would be fought at a distance, on terms it understood. It believed that its institutions could absorb shocks as they always had. The Allia proved otherwise. From this point forward, Rome was no longer reacting to a problem. It was responding to a catastrophe already in motion. Later Roman tradition would treat the defeat as a moral lesson, even associating the day of the battle with ill omens and ritual caution. But beneath the symbolism lies a simpler truth. Rome had been caught unprepared by a form of warfare it did not yet know how to face. The Gauls did not need to understand Rome to defeat it. They only needed to overwhelm it once. And once was enough. With the Roman army destroyed and the city exposed, the final barrier between Rome and disaster had vanished. What followed would not be a battle but an abandonment, a decision made under fear, haste, and disbelief. After the Battle of the Allia, something unprecedented happened in Roman history. Nothing stood in the way. The Roman army had not merely been defeated, it had ceased to function as an army at all. There was no organized force left to delay the enemy, no chain of command capable of issuing orders, no defensive line that could be reformed. The defeat had torn a hole in Rome's security so complete that it exposed the city itself. For the Gauls, the road south lay open. For the Romans, that realization was paralyzing. In Roman military culture, distance mattered. Even a defeated army usually bought time. Days, sometimes weeks, could pass between a battlefield loss and a direct threat to the city. That interval allowed leaders to regroup, call allies, or fortify defenses. None of that was possible now. The Gauls were already too close. The survivors of the Allia fled in different directions. Some ran toward Veii, hoping the old Etruscan city might offer refuge. Others scattered into the countryside, abandoning not just their weapons, but their roles as soldiers. Very few returned to the city itself. This detail is crucial. Rome did not experience the aftermath of the battle as a coordinated retreat. It experienced it as a vacuum. Messengers arrived with fragments of information, rumors of annihilation, exaggerated numbers, accounts of panic and slaughter. Each retelling made the situation feel worse, and the truth was already bad enough. The Senate and magistrates were forced to confront a reality they had never planned for. Rome could not be defended in full. The city's leadership faced an impossible choice. To attempt a full defense with no army would be symbolic at best, suicidal at worst. The walls were incomplete, the population large, and morale collapsing. Holding the entire city would require cohesion that simply no longer existed. Instead, Rome chose triage. Only the most defensible position, the Capitoline Hill, would be held. Everything else would be abandoned. This decision marked a psychological breaking point. Rome had been captured before in legend, threatened in war, humbled in defeat, but never had it willingly conceded its own streets, temples, and homes without a fight. Civilians were told to flee. Those who could leave did so in haste, carrying what little they could. Sacred objects were hidden, buried, or carried away in secret. Priests attempted to preserve rituals even as the city unraveled around them. The evacuation was not orderly. It could not be. Families separated. Property was abandoned. The rhythms of civic life collapsed into instinctive survival. Rome, which prided itself on discipline and continuity, now moved like any other frightened population, reacting, not planning. Those who remained did so for different reasons. Some were too old to flee. Some chose ritual over survival. Later tradition tells of senators sitting in silence in their ceremonial robes, waiting in their homes as if participating in a final civic rite. Whether literal or symbolic, the image mattered deeply to Roman memory. Dignity preserved even as power vanished. Meanwhile, the Gauls advanced. Their march toward Rome was not marked by haste or hesitation. There was no need for urgency. No enemy force opposed them. No gates barred their path. The psychological impact of this advance cannot be overstated, not because of what the Gauls did, but because of what Rome failed to do. There was no second stand, no ambush, no delaying action. The Republic, for the first time, was unable to impose its will even briefly. This silence along the road was more terrifying than resistance would have been. It confirmed to the Gauls that victory was complete, and to the Romans that their assumptions about control were illusions. When the Gauls reached the city, they found it eerily empty. Later Roman writers would emphasize the shock of this moment, the sense of violation not through battle, but through absence. Rome had not been stormed, it had been exposed. The Gauls entered not as conquerors breaking gates, but as intruders stepping into a space that no longer resisted. For the Romans watching from the Capitoline Hill, the sight was unbearable. From above, they could see smoke rising, hear sounds echoing through streets they once controlled, and realize that the heart of their world was now beyond their reach. This was not simply a military loss, it was a collapse of order. Rome's identity was tied to its city. Temples, forums, and homes were not just physical structures, they were anchors of memory and meaning. To abandon them was to admit that survival now mattered more than continuity. That admission would leave scars. What makes this moment especially significant is how quickly it unfolded. The Republic had no gradual descent into crisis. There was no slow tightening of a siege, no drawn-out negotiations. In a matter of days, Rome moved from regional confidence to existential vulnerability. The open road symbolized more than defeat. It revealed how narrow the margin between security and collapse truly was. Rome had believed that danger would always announce itself early enough to be managed. The Allia shattered that belief. The march that followed confirmed it. Power, Rome learned, could vanish not through long struggle, but through a single failure followed by inaction. This realization would echo through Roman history. In later centuries, Rome would obsess over frontiers, buffers, and early warning. It would seek to control territory not just for wealth, but for distance. The memory of enemies reaching the city too quickly would shape policy long after the details of 390 BCE faded. But at this moment, none of that existed yet. There was only shock, fear, and the awareness that the city had been left to its fate. The road had been opened not because Rome lacked courage, but because it lacked preparation for a form of disaster it had never imagined. The Republic had assumed it would always have time to respond. It had assumed wrong. As the Gauls moved freely through Rome's streets, and the defenders huddled above on the Capitoline, the meaning of the defeat began to change. What started as a lost battle was becoming something far worse, a wound to memory, confidence, and identity. The sack itself was about to begin. When the last organized resistance withdrew to the Capitoline Hill, Rome ceased, in any meaningful sense, to function as a city. What remained below was not a battlefield but a hollowed space, streets without order, temples without guardians, homes without families. Rome had not been conquered in the traditional way. It had been left behind. The decision to abandon the city was not taken lightly. For Romans, the city was more than stone and timber. It was the physical expression of their identity. To leave it undefended felt like a betrayal not only of the present generation, but of the ancestors who had built it and the gods who protected it. Yet survival demanded it. As panic spread after the defeat at the Allia, the priority became preservation, not of territory, but of continuity. Sacred objects were hidden or removed in secret rituals. Priests carried relics away under cover of darkness. What could not be saved physically was entrusted to memory, with the hope that one day it might be restored. Ordinary citizens fled with no such certainty. The evacuation was uneven and chaotic. Those with connections or resources escaped first, moving toward allied towns or rural estates. Others followed the roads aimlessly, unsure where safety lay. Families fractured in the confusion. Possessions were abandoned not because they lacked value, but because there was no time to decide what mattered most. For many, the hardest moment came not during flight, but at the threshold, when they turned back for a final look and realized they might never return. This sense of rupture would define Roman memory of the sack. The trauma was not confined to destruction, it lay in separation. Rome was no longer a shared space. Its people were scattered, its rhythms broken. Within the city, those who remained did so by necessity or by choice. Some were simply unable to flee. The elderly, the infirm, the poor, those without horses, carts, or distant refuge, were trapped by circumstance. Their fate would later be absorbed into collective memory, though individual stories were lost. Others stayed deliberately. Roman tradition preserves the image of senators remaining behind, seated in their ceremonial chairs, dressed in full regalia. Whether this scene occurred exactly as described matters less than what it symbolized. It represented a final assertion of dignity in the face of annihilation, a refusal to abandon role, ritual, and identity even when power was gone. These men were not defending the city militarily. They were performing a civic act, turning presence itself into resistance. If Rome was to fall, it would fall with its symbols intact. Above them on the Capitoline Hill, a small garrison prepared for siege. This decision, concentrating defense on a single stronghold, reveals the cold logic that had replaced optimism. The Capitoline was defensible, elevated, and symbolically central. Holding it did not mean saving the city. It meant ensuring that Rome, as an idea, survived. The defenders knew they could not retake the streets below. Their goal was endurance, not victory. Meanwhile, the Gauls entered a city that barely resembled the prize they might have imagined. They encountered silence. No crowds, no resistance, no negotiators, doors stood open, temples were unguarded. The absence of opposition was disorienting. Roman warfare taught that cities fought until submission or surrender. Here, there was neither. This absence shaped the sack as much as violence did. With no authority to negotiate and no army to defeat, the Gauls moved freely. Looting followed instinct rather than strategy. Fire spread unpredictably, driven by chance more than design. The destruction was real but uneven. Some structures burned, others were spared, often arbitrarily. For the Romans watching from above, this randomness was unbearable. They could not predict what would be lost, what would survive, or what might be recoverable. The city they knew was dissolving in fragments, without pattern or meaning. Psychologically, this was devastating. Rome's identity relied on continuity, on the belief that institutions, rituals, and spaces endured beyond individual lives. The sack challenged that belief at its core. If temples could be entered without consequence, if streets could be abandoned, if the city could exist without its people, then what was Rome, really? This question would haunt Roman thought for generations. The abandonment also reshaped Rome's relationship with its gods. In Roman religion, divine favor was demonstrated through protection. Victory, survival, and prosperity were signs of alignment between city and deity. The sack disrupted that logic. Had the gods abandoned Rome, or had Rome failed its gods? Later interpretations would struggle with this dilemma, offering explanations rooted in ritual neglect, moral failure, or fate. But at the moment itself, there was only confusion. Prayer continued, but certainty was gone. For those trapped within the city, the experience blurred into survival. Some hid, some negotiated individually, some perished anonymously. Roman historians rarely lingered on these stories, perhaps because they resisted heroic framing. Instead, memory focused upward to the Capitoline, to endurance rather than loss. This selective memory served a purpose. Rome would later rebuild not only its walls but its narrative. To do so, it needed to emphasize resilience, not helplessness. But the abandonment could not be erased. Even centuries later, Roman writers spoke of this moment with unease. It was remembered not just as a defeat, but as a moment when Rome ceased to be fully itself. The city existed physically, but its social fabric had been torn. In later years, Rome would become obsessed with preventing repetition. Walls would be strengthened, borders expanded, enemies confronted far from the city itself. The Republic and later the Empire would carry the lesson forward. The city must never again be left alone. But at this moment, none of that lay in the future. There was only waiting. Waiting on the hill, listening to unfamiliar sounds drift upward from streets once known intimately. Waiting to see whether the Gauls would grow bored, desperate, or vindictive. waiting to learn whether survival was still possible. The abandonment of the city was not the end of the sack. It was the transformation of the crisis into something deeper, a test of whether Rome could endure without the physical space that defined it. The Gauls could burn buildings, they could take gold, they could silence streets. What they could not yet know was whether Rome, stripped of its body, would still possess a will to return. That question would soon be answered, not in the streets below, but in the hunger, fear, and endurance of those who held the hill. The sack of Rome was not a single, coherent act. It unfolded unevenly, shaped less by plan than by opportunity, confusion, and absence. What later generations would imagine as a moment of overwhelming violence was, in reality, a slower and more unsettling experience, defined as much by silence as by destruction. With the city largely abandoned, the Gauls encountered a space without resistance. There were no barricades to break, no defenders to cut down in the streets, no central authority to negotiate surrender. This altered the nature of the sack from the very beginning. Roman sources, writing centuries later, struggled with this detail. A sack without a final battle conflicted with Roman expectations of how cities fell. To resolve this discomfort, later accounts emphasized fire, slaughter, and spectacle. Yet beneath these embellishments lies a quieter, more disorienting truth. Rome was taken not through conquest, but through vacancy. The first fires likely began by accident. Wooden structures, open hearths, and unattended workshops created a city primed for ignition. As the Gauls moved through neighborhoods, looting what was valuable and breaking what was not, flames spread unpredictably. Some districts burned heavily, others remained strangely intact. This randomness haunted Roman memory. The destruction did not follow logic or hierarchy. Grand buildings could survive while modest homes vanished. Sacred spaces were violated not out of sacrilege, but indifference. The city's carefully layered meanings dissolved into chaos. For the Romans watching from the Capitoline Hill, the experience was one of helpless observation. They could see smoke rising from familiar quarters, hear unfamiliar voices echoing in streets once ordered by law and custom, and do nothing but endure. Silence became its own weapon. Without the noise of battle, without the rhythm of resistance, the sack took on a dreamlike quality. The absence of familiar sounds, markets, rituals, civic gatherings, was more disturbing than the presence of violence. Rome was alive, but it no longer spoke in its own voice. The Gauls, for their part, did not treat the city as a symbolic enemy. They treated it as a resource. Gold, bronze, tools, and textiles were taken where found. Objects without obvious value were discarded or destroyed. There was no systematic attempt to erase Roman culture because there was no perceived need to do so. This indifference cut deeper than deliberate desecration would have. Roman identity was built on recognition, on the belief that Rome mattered, that its spaces commanded respect even from enemies. The sack challenged that belief brutally. To the Gauls, Rome was not yet a world center. It was simply a place that had failed to defend itself. The famous images of senators seated in silence, awaiting death, belong to this phase of memory. Whether or not such scenes occurred exactly as described, they reflect a deeper truth. Rome remembered the sack not as chaos alone, but as stillness in the face of annihilation. These stories served a function. They reclaimed agency where none had existed. If Rome could not fight, it could at least endure with dignity. Not all silence was dignified. Many who had been unable to flee hid within the city, moving cautiously through ruins, listening for footsteps, surviving moment by moment. Their experiences rarely entered official histories, but they shaped the emotional reality of the sack. Fear did not roar, it whispered. The Gauls remained in the city longer than might be expected. Disease, heat, and supply issues soon became concerns. Rome, stripped of governance, offered little structure even to its occupiers. Looting reached a point of diminishing returns. Above all, the presence of the fortified Capitoline frustrated total control. From below, the hill stood as a reminder that Rome was not entirely extinguished. From above, the city below appeared alien and unreachable. This physical division symbolized a deeper fracture. Rome existed simultaneously as a defeated city and an enduring idea. Fire eventually gave way to exhaustion. Fires burned themselves out or were left behind as the Gauls shifted focus. The sack lost intensity not because mercy intervened, but because there was less left to take. What remained was a scarred landscape and a population suspended between hope and despair. In later centuries, Roman authors would emphasize the brutality of the sack to heighten the drama of recovery. Flames, slaughter, and humiliation filled their accounts, but these portrayals often say more about Roman anxieties than historical reality. What truly wounded Rome was not total destruction, but uncertainty. The sack revealed that Rome could be ignored, entered, and damaged without ritual or resistance, that its survival depended not on destiny, but on preparation, that silence could be more dangerous than noise. This realization would reshape Roman thinking about power. In the future, Rome would seek not just to defeat enemies, but to ensure they never reached the city at all. Distance would become security. Control would replace assumption. But during the sack itself, none of that clarity existed. There was only waiting, waiting to see whether the Gauls would leave, whether the Capitoline would fall, whether Rome could still imagine itself as Rome when the fires died down. Silence in this moment was not peace, it was a question. And the answer had not yet come. High above the ruined streets of Rome, the Capitoline Hill became something it had never been before. The entire republic compressed into a single position. What remained of Roman authority, identity, and hope gathered there, not as a confident force but as a fragile remnant. The hill was defensible, elevated, and symbolically sacred, yet its strength was relative. It could delay defeat. It could not guarantee survival. The defenders on the Capitoline were not numerous. They consisted of soldiers who had escaped the disaster at the Allia, magistrates, priests, and civilians capable of bearing arms. They were united not by strategy, but by necessity. This was not a garrison chosen for its readiness. It was a cross-section of what Rome had left. Their goal was simple: endure. Food supplies were limited from the beginning. Water could be secured, but only with caution. Each day that passed tightened the grip of hunger and exhaustion. The defenders could not predict how long the Gauls would remain in the city below, nor whether relief would ever come. For the Gauls, the hill represented an incomplete victory. They had taken the city, but not the final symbol of Roman power. The Capitoline loomed above them, visible and defiant. To leave it unconquered risked turning a triumph into an unfinished act. Yet assaulting it directly posed its own dangers. The slope was steep, access limited, and defenders desperate. Casualties would be high and the reward uncertain. The Gauls chose patience. Thus began a siege, not formal, not methodical, but effective. The Gauls cut off access, watching and waiting. They tested the hill's defenses with probing actions, gauging weaknesses without committing fully. The Romans responded cautiously, conserving strength, understanding that every loss was irreplaceable. Time became the battlefield. Inside the Capitoline, daily life narrowed to survival. Rituals continued, not out of habit, but necessity. Prayer offered structure when command could not. The presence of priests among the defenders reinforced the belief that the hill was not merely a military position, but a sacred refuge. This belief mattered. Rome's relationship with its gods was transactional. Protection was expected in exchange for observance. The fact that the Capitoline still held, while the rest of the city lay exposed, was interpreted as a sign that divine favor had not fully withdrawn. This interpretation sustained morale. One of the most enduring stories from this period involves the sacred geese of Juno. According to later tradition, these birds alerted the defenders to a nighttime Gallic attempt to scale the hill, their cries awakening the Romans in time to repel the attack. Whether the incident occurred exactly as described is uncertain. What matters is why the story endured. The geese represented vigilance when human systems had failed. They symbolized divine intervention not through grand miracles, but through attentiveness. Rome remembered not just that it survived, but that survival came from unexpected awareness. The story also softened the humiliation of the sack. If Rome had been saved by the gods, even indirectly, then the disaster could be reframed as a trial rather than a rejection. For the defenders, each day on the Capitoline reinforced a brutal reality. They could not reclaim the city. They could only prevent complete erasure. Below them, the Gauls grew restless. Supplies dwindled. Disease spread. The city offered little comfort and no long-term advantage. The initial momentum of victory had faded, replaced by discomfort and impatience. Holding Rome was proving less rewarding than taking it had been. This shift opened the possibility of negotiation. The Capitoline holdout transformed the power dynamic. Rome was defeated but not extinguished. The Gauls, victorious but stalled, faced diminishing returns. Both sides now had incentives to reach an agreement. This balance was precarious. Had the Capitoline fallen, Rome's story might have ended here, or taken an entirely different path. Had the Gauls chosen to abandon the city without negotiation, Roman recovery might have been slower and more chaotic. Instead, both sides arrived at an uneasy convergence. The hill had held long enough to matter. From a broader perspective, the Capitoline holdout became a foundational myth of Roman resilience. It demonstrated that Rome could lose everything except its core, and that this core, once tested, could endure. Later Roman ideology would elevate this moment as proof that the Republic survived not because of fortune alone, but because it refused to vanish completely. Even at its lowest point, Rome had remained present, watching, waiting, resisting in the only way it still could. Yet it is important not to romanticize the experience. The holdout was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was anxious, hungry, and uncertain. Victory was never assured. Survival was measured in days, not triumphs. This realism is what gives the episode its weight. The Capitoline did not represent invincibility. It represented endurance without illusion. Rome learned that holding ground was sometimes more important than winning battles, and that survival could itself become a form of resistance. When negotiations finally emerged, they did so not from strength, but from exhaustion on both sides. The outcome would leave Rome humiliated but alive. And for Rome, in that moment, survival was enough. As the siege of the Capitoline dragged on, the sack of Rome entered its most enduring phase, not because of what happened militarily, but because of what was remembered. This is the moment when Brennus steps fully into the Roman story. Historically, Brennus is a shadowy figure. We know little about him beyond his role in this event and the legend that grew around it. Roman sources present him as a Gallic leader, confident, contemptuous, and unmoved by Roman appeals. Whether this portrait reflects reality or Roman imagination matters less than how it functioned. Brennus became the face of humiliation. By the time negotiations began, both sides were strained. The Romans on the Capitoline were starving. The Gauls occupying the city were increasingly uncomfortable, vulnerable to disease, and eager to leave with tangible reward. Neither side could decisively defeat the other. The solution was ransom. Rome would pay gold in exchange for the Gauls' withdrawal. This alone was a bitter concession. Rome had ransomed individuals before, but never the city itself. The act acknowledged defeat in the most public way possible. According to Roman tradition, when the gold was weighed, the Gauls used rigged scales. When the Romans protested, Brennus threw his sword onto the balance and uttered the words that would echo through Roman memory. Vi victis. Woe to the conquered. Whether Brennus truly spoke these words is unknowable. What matters is that Romans believed he did, or needed to believe he did. The phrase encapsulated everything Rome feared in that moment. It expressed not just defeat but powerlessness. The defeated had no recourse, no appeal, no authority left to invoke. Justice belonged to the victor, and mercy was optional. For Romans raised on law, ritual, and reciprocity, this was a shattering idea. The episode became a moral wound. Roman historians returned to it repeatedly, using it as a warning and a lesson. Never again, they insisted, should Rome be placed in a position where its fate depended on the goodwill of others. In this sense, Brennus was less an individual than a symbol. He represented a world without Roman order, a world where strength alone determined outcome. By personifying that world in a single figure, Roman memory could contain and confront it. Brennus became the embodiment of everything Rome resolved to eliminate from its future. The ransom itself marked a turning point. Gold that might have strengthened Rome was carried away by outsiders. The act was humiliating, but it preserved life. The Gauls withdrew, satisfied that they had extracted sufficient reward and that further occupation offered diminishing returns. Rome was spared annihilation, but at a cost that went far beyond wealth. The phrase vi victis endured because it captured a truth Rome could not ignore. Morality without power was fragile. Law without enforcement was meaningless. Civilization, if unprotected, could be mocked and exploited. This realization would shape Roman behavior for centuries. In later generations, Roman commanders would invoke the memory of Brennus as justification for ruthless action. Preemptive strikes, harsh terms, and uncompromising dominance were framed as necessities learned through suffering. Mercy became a luxury reserved for the secure. Even the concept of victory itself changed. Rome would no longer settle for survival. It would seek control so absolute that ransom would never again be conceivable. Enemies would be defeated far from the city, stripped of resources, and integrated, or destroyed, before they could threaten the heart of Roman power. The humiliation of the scales was not erased by time. It was transformed into doctrine. Roman tradition, uncomfortable with this humiliation, later introduced alternative versions of the ending. Some claimed that a Roman hero arrived in time to drive off the Gauls and reclaim the gold. Others suggested that the ransom was never truly paid. These variations reveal more about Roman psychology than historical fact. Rome needed to believe that humiliation could be undone, that dignity, once lost, could be reclaimed through strength or divine favor. But the persistence of vi victis suggests that the wound never fully healed. The phrase endured because it remained true. Rome remembered that it had once stood on the losing side of power, forced to accept injustice without appeal. This memory fueled an obsession with never being vulnerable again. Brennus, whether real or mythologized, became the voice of that lesson. His words condensed an entire trauma into 3 syllables that could be recalled instantly, across generations. This is why the sack of Rome mattered. Not because buildings burned or gold was lost, but because Rome learned what defeat felt like when stripped of illusion. It learned that survival did not equal dignity, and that memory itself could be a weapon. When the Gauls finally departed, Rome was left wounded but alive. The city would rebuild. Its walls would rise stronger than before. Its armies would reform. But something else had changed permanently. Rome would never again forget what it meant to be conquered. After humiliation comes the need for restoration. For Rome, the sack of Rome left a wound that survival alone could not heal. The city still stood, its people returned. Life resumed in fragments, but dignity, once lost, demanded explanation, correction, and, if possible, redemption. This is where Marcus Furius Camillus enters the story. Historically, Camillus was a successful Roman commander, remembered for his campaigns against Veii and other rivals. In Roman tradition, however, he became something far larger, the savior who redeemed Rome at its lowest moment. According to later accounts, Camillus arrived at the decisive moment, either interrupting the ransom or avenging it shortly after, driving the Gauls from the city and restoring Roman honor. In some versions, he refused to recognize the ransom agreement altogether, declaring that Rome was to be ransomed by iron, not gold. These stories are powerful. They are also deeply suspect. The earliest sources offer little evidence that Camillus actually saved Rome during the sack itself. His role appears to grow over time, shaped by Rome's need to reinterpret humiliation as near victory. What likely occurred was far less dramatic. The Gauls withdrew after receiving ransom, and Rome rebuilt slowly, painfully, and without immediate revenge. But Rome could not live with that version alone. The figure of Camillus served a psychological function. He allowed Rome to reclaim agency in a narrative where it otherwise had none. By inserting a heroic intervention, Roman memory softened the blow of defeat and reframed survival as triumph delayed rather than dignity surrendered. This impulse reveals something essential about Roman identity. Rome did not deny disaster, it reworked it. Failures were acknowledged, but only as preludes to renewal. In this sense, Camillus was not just a man, he was a solution to a narrative problem. By elevating him, Rome asserted that even in defeat, its virtues endured. Discipline, courage, and resolve had not vanished. They had merely awaited the right moment to reassert themselves. The title later bestowed upon Camillus, second founder of Rome, underscores this role. Founders do not simply build cities, they define meaning. By positioning Camillus as a founder figure, Rome implied that the sack marked not an end but a rebirth. Yet this reinterpretation came at a cost. By focusing on salvation, Roman tradition risked obscuring the lessons of vulnerability. The sack had revealed structural weaknesses, strategic blind spots, and dangerous assumptions. Turning the ending into a heroic reversal could encourage complacency, an illusion that Rome would always be rescued at the last moment. Roman history would oscillate between these two impulses, realism born of trauma and myth-making born of pride. Camillus stands at the intersection of both. Even if his intervention was exaggerated, his later career mattered. He became a symbol of disciplined leadership, moral authority, and unity across class divisions. In this sense, Camillus represented what Rome believed it needed to become after the sack: stronger, more cohesive, and less tolerant of internal fracture. The emphasis on Camillus also redirected blame. If Rome had been saved by a hero, then responsibility for the sack could be displaced, from systemic failure to individual absence. The disaster happened not because Rome was unprepared, but because Camillus was temporarily unavailable. Once restored, order followed. This reframing was comforting, but incomplete. Rome would, in fact, undertake serious reforms after the sack. Walls were strengthened, military organization evolved, expansion accelerated. These changes suggest that beneath the myth of salvation, Rome internalized the lesson that endurance alone was insufficient. Camillus, real or imagined, became a bridge between trauma and reform. He allowed Rome to look forward without denying the past. His story offered continuity. The Republic had faltered, but its core values, embodied in exemplary individuals, remained intact. This duality explains why Camillus endured in Roman memory while others faded. He was not remembered simply for what he did, but for what he represented, the possibility that Rome could recover moral authority after total humiliation. Yet even as Rome embraced this narrative, the wound of 390 BCE never fully closed. Roman writers continued to mention the sack with unease, long after Camillus's legend had solidified. The fear it inspired lingered beneath confidence, reminding each generation that salvation was not guaranteed. Camillus reassured Rome that heroes could emerge. The sack taught Rome that heroes were not enough. Together, these lessons shaped Roman behavior in the centuries that followed. Rome would build systems designed not to require rescue, to ensure that no single defeat, no single absence could again expose the city itself. Leadership would matter, but preparation would matter more. In this way, the question of Camillus's salvation reveals a deeper truth. Rome did not survive because it was saved. It survived because it learned. And that learning would define its future far more than any single act of heroism. When the Gauls finally withdrew, they left behind a city that was standing, but profoundly altered. Rome had not been erased, but it had been exposed. Smoke still lingered in places. Neighborhoods lay in ruin. Families returned to streets that no longer felt familiar. The physical damage mattered, but it was not the most important consequence of the sack. What Rome had lost was certainty. In the weeks and months that followed, survival turned into reconstruction. Citizens came back from exile and hiding. Civic life resumed slowly, unevenly, shaped by scarcity and trauma. The Senate reconvened. Magistrates reasserted authority. Rituals were restored, not because all believed again, but because order demanded continuity. Yet beneath these outward signs of recovery, something fundamental had changed. Rome rebuilt from fear, not confidence. Before 390 BCE, Rome had assumed that threats could be managed within known boundaries. After the sack, it understood that danger could arrive suddenly, without warning, and from beyond its familiar world. This realization reshaped priorities. The most visible response was defensive. The city's fortifications were strengthened dramatically. Walls were no longer symbolic boundaries. They became essential infrastructure. Stone replaced assumption. Height replaced hope. Rome would never again rely on incomplete defenses or goodwill alone. This was not just an architectural decision, it was psychological. Walls reassured the population. They marked a line between vulnerability and safety, between the chaos of the outside world and the order Rome sought to impose within. Every block laid in stone was a rejection of the humiliation Rome had endured. Military reform followed. Rome's army evolved, not through sudden revolution, but through accumulated lessons. Flexibility became valued. Organization improved. The Republic began to think more carefully about command, reserves, and response time. The memory of the Allia lingered as a warning against complacency. Rome also changed how it thought about enemies. No longer were threats categorized only by proximity or tradition. The sack taught Rome that unfamiliar peoples could be just as dangerous as known rivals, perhaps more so. Rome began to look outward, beyond its immediate neighbors, seeking not only to defend, but to dominate. Expansion in this context was not purely ambition, it was prevention. By pushing its boundaries outward, Rome created buffers between itself and potential threats. Distance became security. Control became peace. This logic would drive Roman policy for centuries, often with devastating consequences for others. Internally, the sack intensified Rome's struggle with unity. In moments of crisis, division proved fatal. The memory of abandonment and panic reinforced the need for cohesion, at least rhetorically. Appeals to shared suffering became tools of political persuasion. Rome emphasized collective identity over faction, even as social tensions persisted. This tension would never fully resolve, but the sack gave unity a moral urgency it had previously lacked. Religion, too, was reinterpreted. Rome did not abandon its gods. Instead, it doubled down on ritual precision. If divine protection had wavered, the solution was not disbelief, but stricter observance. Neglect, not indifference, was blamed. The sack became a reminder that Rome's relationship with the divine required constant maintenance. This interpretation offered reassurance. Disaster was not random, it was corrective. Memory itself became institutionalized. The defeat at the Allia was marked as an unlucky day in the Roman calendar. Ritual caution surrounded its anniversary. By embedding trauma into time, Rome ensured that the lesson would not fade. Memory became policy. Yet rebuilding was not only reactive. Rome also demonstrated remarkable resilience. Homes were reconstructed, markets reopened, the rhythms of daily life resumed. Children grew up hearing stories of the sack not as a present fear, but as inherited memory. This transition, from lived trauma to remembered lesson, was crucial. It allowed Rome to move forward without forgetting. The sack became a reference point, not a paralysis. It shaped behavior without freezing it. Perhaps most importantly, Rome redefined what survival meant. Before the sack, survival had been taken for granted. After it, survival was understood as something that had to be secured actively, continuously, and sometimes brutally. Peace was no longer assumed. It had to be enforced. This shift explains much of Rome's later history. The Republic and later the Empire would justify conquest as defense, domination as stability, and harshness as necessity. These rationales did not emerge from arrogance alone. They were rooted in fear remembered and institutionalized. Rome rebuilt its walls, but it also rebuilt its worldview. The sack had stripped away illusions. In their place emerged a harder, more vigilant Rome, one less willing to rely on fortune, more determined to control outcomes. Yet fear is a double-edged foundation. It can strengthen resolve, but it can also justify excess. Rome's future successes would be inseparable from the anxieties born in 390 BCE. The city's rise would carry the imprint of its fall. Rebuilding from fear allowed Rome to survive. It also ensured that Rome would never again accept vulnerability, not for itself, and not for those it would later rule. Long after the fires cooled and the walls were rebuilt, the sack of Rome refused to settle into the past. It remained alive, not as a continuous fear, but as a reference point, a moment to which Romans returned whenever they questioned their own strength, their gods, or the stability of their world. Few events in Roman history were remembered with such persistent unease. This persistence is telling. Rome experienced far greater disasters in later centuries. Armies were annihilated, provinces revolted, civil wars tore the Republic apart, and yet the sack by the Gauls retained a unique place in Roman memory. It was not the most destructive event Rome endured, but it was the most revealing. The sack exposed something Rome preferred to forget, that its survival was not guaranteed. For generations, Roman writers referred to the event simply as the sack, as if no clarification were needed. The name alone carried meaning. It evoked vulnerability, humiliation, and the terrifying realization that Rome could fall without warning. Even at the height of empire, this memory lingered. Roman commanders invoked it when arguing for preemptive war. Politicians cited it when calling for stronger defenses or harsher policies. The fear of enemies reaching the city itself shaped strategic thinking long after the original threat had vanished. Rome's obsession with distance, pushing borders ever outward, was not only ambition, it was memory. Each conquered region placed another layer between the city and the trauma it once endured. The sack also shaped Rome's moral vocabulary. The phrase "vi victis" endured not because Romans admired it, but because they feared it. It became a warning encoded in language: defeat strips away justice, and only power prevents humiliation. This lesson justified Rome's later refusal to accept vulnerability in any form. Mercy in Roman thought became conditional. It was offered from strength, never from weakness. The event also influenced how Rome understood itself historically. Roman identity was built on recovery. Founding myths emphasized rebirth after chaos. The sack fit neatly into this pattern. It became a dark chapter that validated Rome's resilience, reinforcing the idea that suffering purified rather than destroyed. Yet this interpretation was uneasy. Roman writers could never fully domesticate the sack. It resisted heroic framing. Unlike other defeats, it could not be redeemed entirely by later victories. The humiliation remained too stark, too personal. This discomfort explains why Roman tradition produced competing endings. Heroic interventions, divine rescues, reclaimed gold. Each version attempted to soften the memory, to restore dignity retroactively. But the very need for these variations reveals how deeply the wound ran. The sack was not just an external threat overcome. It was an internal reckoning. It forced Rome to confront the limits of its assumptions about enemies, about destiny, about protection. Even Roman religion bore its mark. Rituals commemorated the defeat. Certain days were treated with caution. The calendar itself carried traces of trauma. Time, like space, became structured by memory. This institutionalization of fear ensured that the lesson endured even when direct experience faded. Children learned of the sack as history, not as lived pain, but the emotional weight remained. And that weight mattered. It shaped Rome's response to future crises. When later invaders threatened Italy, memories of the Gauls surfaced. When enemies approached the city, panic echoed older fear. The sack became a mental template for catastrophe. Yet Rome also learned something else. It learned that identity could survive loss of territory, wealth, and even dignity. That Rome existed not solely in walls or armies, but in shared memory and collective will. The Capitoline had held not because it was invincible, but because Rome refused to disappear entirely. This lesson balanced fear with resolve. Rome did not seek to avoid history by forgetting. It carried history forward as instruction. The sack became a cautionary tale, not a fatal one. In this sense, 390 BCE was not merely a moment of collapse. It was a moment of transformation. Rome emerged from it more cautious, more aggressive, more determined to control its fate. The republic that followed was not the same as the one that had faced the Gauls. It was harder, more vigilant, and less forgiving. This transformation came at a cost, to others and eventually to Rome itself. But its roots lay here, in a city that once burned and remembered. The sack taught Rome that power must be maintained constantly, that vulnerability invites disaster, and that memory itself can be a weapon. Rome would wield that weapon well. Long after the Gauls were gone, long after Brennus became legend and Camillus became myth, the lesson remained carved into Roman consciousness. Never again. Not because Rome could not fall, but because it had once and survived. And survival, once tested, became the foundation of everything that followed. If you'd like to keep exploring history's biggest questions, you're welcome to subscribe and continue this journey. And if there's a moment from the past you think deserves a deeper look, feel free to share it in the comments.